So this is joint work with my friend and colleague Martin Rohde, who's at the University of Navarra in Spain. And it is called Late Colonial Antecedents of Modern Democracy. Now, we don't ask a new question in this paper. We sort of ask two old questions, but we hope that we can convince you that our answers are interesting because we have new data and we have a new way of looking at these old questions. What are the old questions? Well, the big question is, why are some countries democratic? There's been a long literature for close to 70 years now. A lot of it starts with Seymour Lipset's 1959 paper, where he argues that economic development is going to lead to democracy. Parts of it is because economic development also means that you get better educated, people can read. There are going to be newspapers, there's going to be information, which is, in Lipset's view, a condition for having democracy. The other thing is that he believes that economic development is going to lead to industrialization, and industrialization is going to lead to stable class interests, which will give rise to a stable modern party system, which is the other condition for him for a democracy. Now, Lipset has been very influential for a long time, but a lot of people think that he might be wrong. Now, you can see a correlation between economic development and democracy. Most rich countries are democracies. However, about 30 years ago, Adam Przeworski questioned this simple correlation and said, well, democratization might just be completely random. It might happen at critical junctures. It might just happen for random reasons. But democracy only becomes a stable kind of political institution once you have a relatively rich country. So once it's rich enough and complex enough and you have a modern bureaucracy that sort of works, democracy might be a stable type of political institution. But the road to democracy might be fairly random. In recent years, Daniel Treisman has paraded a paper out, a beautiful paper that's now forthcoming in the APSR, where he shows very convincingly, I think, that about 75% of all democratization episodes are really mistakes. They arise because an incumbent autocrat tries to protect his or her power and fails. So the paper is called Democracy by Mistake, and that really gives even more support to Przeworski's old idea that perhaps democratization is just random. Now, my colleagues Martin Palderman and Gundlach have also admitted that, well, episodes might be random. You can't really predict when a country becomes more or less democratic, but you can predict the direction. Richer countries are just more likely to move in a more democratic direction. Now, there's an entirely different literature that is also influential, that's been influential for about 20 years. And it starts with Daron Acemoglu's idea that deep historical factors are important. We're going to challenge this idea in the following. Acemoglu and Robinson's idea is that European settlement patterns influence the way political institutions developed, and those historical political institutions are likely to continue to today, more or less. The idea is that in countries with really bad disease environments, malaria-ridden countries, countries where you die of many different diseases, settlers will not settle permanently. They're going to adopt a grab-and-run strategy. So they don't want good judicial institutions, they don't want checks and balances, and they don't need representative political institutions. On the other hand, where Europeans settle for good, they want to bring the kinds of political institutions to the colony that they've been used to at home. So Acemoglu and Robinson's idea is that where many Europeans settle for good, you're likely to have, or at least develop, more democratic, more representative institutions over time. Now, Jakob Rea has also challenged this idea. he says that, well, it's actually mostly about established state structures prior to colonization. His idea is that where you did not have established state structures, the colony moves in with its own institutions, including some version of democracy, or at least quasi-representative institutions. But where you had established state structures, colonies used those to govern through, and therefore didn't implement democracy. So you can see this is a big and very voluminous literature, and it's a literature that really doesn't agree on exactly what's going on. Now, many new studies focus on the early colonial period. As I said, Acemoglu and Robinson has this hypothesis based on settler mortality. These are more or less the first settlers. Engelman and Sokolov's ideas about land inequality and old comparative advantages, essentially why do some countries stay poor even if they were rich 300 years ago, is also a hypothesis about the early colonial period and how things settled in the early colonial period. Now, our new thing, or one of the new things in the paper, is that we focus on the late colonial period. We believe, or at least argue, that if, for example, Acemoglu's idea about settler interests is so important, then we should expect to see very similar and probably also stronger patterns in the late colonial period. And when we say the late colonial period, we focus on the interwar period and the years from the end of World War II and until independence. Now, in the early 20th century, a lot of people moved out of Europe and moved to the US, to Argentina, to Brazil, to Australia, and a lot of people also moved to a number of other colonies. So you get an influx of British farmers in East Africa, for example. You get an influx of French people in West Africa. You get Germans moving to Namibia. So a lot of the settler patterns would be very, very strong in that late colonial period. And if settler characteristics are important, then we would be able to see that reflected in the political institutions very close to independence, so in the very late colonial period. So our focus here is on this late period, and that includes our database development. Now, one of the selling points, if I may, of this paper is the new data. The new data come from what is sometimes just referred to as the Bjornskov database. It was originally conceived for entirely other purposes. So Martin Rohde and I needed to update some democracy data for a paper that we were writing at the time. We used the Yearbook and Vreeland democracy and dictatorship dataset, which provides a simple 0-1 indicator for whether or not you have democracy. It also sorts democracies into 3 types and autocracies into 3 types. So we updated that and eventually decided, well, we might as well update it to today and get as many countries as we can. So the database today includes 208 countries observed from 1950 until now. You might say 208 countries. That's more countries that there are in the world. Well, the 208 includes 16 countries that are not sovereign today. So they, for example, include Bermuda and the Cayman Islands that are both British overseas territories with home rule. That allows us, therefore, if we want to compare countries that became independent with fairly similar countries that chose to remain colonies. Another thing is that we also, for an entirely different project, needed to develop better data for coups, coup d'etat. We eventually merged that into our big database project So part of the database today is also a full list with specific information on 539 coup attempts since 1950. As some of you might know, the latest in the data set is the successful military coup in Sudan last year. And once we actually developed these things, we realized that many colonies had interesting political institutions prior to independence. Let me give you an example. Jamaica was a British colony for several centuries. It became fully democratic in 1942. So it had fair and free, perfectly neat democratic elections before then. In 1942, they moved to a full suffrage. So everyone, every adult is allowed to vote in Jamaica. But Jamaica doesn't become independent before 1962. So the last 20 years of its time as a British colony, it has both home rule and a political system that is at least as democratic as most of Western Europe. Bermuda is another example. Bermuda actually has one of the oldest parliaments in the world. So you might say Bermuda is a very old democracy. That's what Bermudans say themselves. However, once you dig into the data, and it is all in our database, you'll realize that Bermuda had a wealth requirement for voting that they only abandoned in the late 1960s. So they have free and fair elections. Government does change hands once in a while, but you have to show that you have some property before you can vote. So what we did in the database, and this is the basis for the paper today, is that we carefully coded what political institutions looked like prior to independence for about 92 countries that either are colonies today or became independent after 1950. And there are big differences. If you go to the late colonial period, this is 1950. Algeria has elections for what's called l'Assemblée algérienne, which is a parliament. They elect 60 Europeans and 60 Algerians on separate roles. So Europeans elect Europeans to parliament, Algerians elect Algerians. You can see they elect 60 of each, but only 10% of the population was European at the time, and only men could vote. So this is a typical way that kind of political institution is set up in many colonies. You do have representation of the locals, but it's heavily biased towards the white or European population. Now, Belize, what was called British Honduras at the time, had elections for a legislative council. They had 3 official members, they had 4 nominated members, and then 6 elected members, and a literacy requirement. Everyone could vote, including women, as long as you could show that you could actually read. That's also a typical institution here, where you have the offices members and a share of elected members. And in many colonies, what happens is that over time, the share of directly elected members increases. So at some point in time, it actually becomes a reasonably full democracy because most members of parliament are elected. Now, Mali is a special case here. Mali had elections for what they call the Conseil Général. 20 were elected in the first college, which was the European college, 30 in the second, the African college. But by 1958, that changes. And it changes with what's called La Loi IV, which is a law voted through the French Parliament in 1956 that paves the way for independence. La Loi IV means that every single French colony that is going to be independent is going to have its own elected parliament. So Mali has elections in 1958 for what they call l'Assemblée territoriale, the territorial assembly, with full suffrage. And amazingly, by independence in 1960, the Malinese politicians themselves have wiggled into a position where it is de facto a one-party system. It's an example of what we know, that the French system is formally a democracy in the very late colonial period up to independence, but in most cases, the French direct the elections anyhow. They rig elections, they direct them, and they, in other ways, try to affect election outcomes. The British don't. Now, lastly, to give you an example from your neighboring country. At the time, it was called Rhodesia. It had elections from 1950 to 1962 for a legislative council with wealth and literacy restrictions. So you had to have a bit of property, really not much, and you had to be able to show that you could read. That was, in a way, a fairly effective way in the interwar years of keeping Black voters out. But as more and more Black people in Rhodesia are able to read, Rhodesia and now Zimbabwe used to be famous for having fairly good schools. More and more people could actually read and eventually could vote. And with the election of Ian Smith in 1962, that all changes, and Rhodesia introduces apartheid and is therefore not at all democratic anymore. It's one of the few cases we have of a colony that actually dismantles its own democratic institutions. But as you can see, we have a number of different colonial approaches. Very often, we think about colonies as this fairly similar, homogeneous group of poor countries. But what Martin and I discovered in the database development is that they were dramatically different. The British treated each colony as unique. Some of them had asserted themselves very, very early on. So Bermuda and Barbados have very, very old parliamentary traditions. Bechuanaland, present-day Botswana, had its first elections in 1961. Now, the difference here is that the British, once they introduced or allowed democratic elections, always, or practically always, accepted the election results. They did not try to manage the elections. Now, the French typically did. We find a couple of examples of where they didn't. And that is, for example, the first democratic elections in Sierra Leone. But typically, they formally give all of their colonies democratic political institutions. De facto, they are what we now call illiberal autocracies or multi-party autocracies. So very much like a country like Nicaragua, where you have multi-party elections, but the government can't lose. The Dutch did things mostly like the British. The Portuguese just couldn't care about elections at all. So you have this vast diversity in the late colonial period. Now, what we ask here is to what extent that characterizes the present day political institutions. And the other selling point here is that we use a unique source of information about colonies in the late colonial period. It's the Statesman's Yearbook. Now, the Statesman's Yearbook has been published since the late 19th century. It's still published. It gives a lot of information on all sorts of different countries in the world. And the great thing about the late colonial period, that's the 40s and 50s in particular, into the 60s also, is that the Statesman's Yearbook has a lot of clear statistical information from colonies. You don't get that anywhere else. But this particular yearbook, for example, has for most colonies information about the size of the European or the white population. So they have demographic information. Sometimes they also have information about the Indian population. How large is that? So some of the Statesman yearbooks in the early 1950s gives you the relative size of the Indian population in British East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. We get information about the overall population. We get information about whether or not there are institutions of higher education. So a number of colonies only have primary schools. Some have secondary schools. Some actually have universities. That's the case for Sudan. We know whether they have home rule. We of course know which colonial master ruled the country. And we actually gather all that kind of information for the early 1950s from the Statesman's Yearbook, 5 editions that we could get either in Aarhus or in Hamburg. And we match that with the information we have in our own database on political institutions, whether they had no representation at all, which was typical of the Belgian colonies, whether they had representation in unfair or rigged elections, or whether they actually had representation with full democratic elections. This gives us not, as Acemoglu and Engerman and Sokolov and other people have focused on, information about the institutions in the early colonial period. We focus on the political institutions in the late colonial period. And let me give you this. This is the transition matrix. So here what we have is how many colonies where we have full data that had colonial autocracy. So that would be either no elections or managed unfair elections. So we have 29 of those. 28 of those countries had home rule. Now, you can see the diagonal here. Of the 30 countries, 39 countries that had democracy in the late colonial period, 30 are democracies today. Only 9 have reverted to being autocracies, and only 7 countries that were not already democratic in the late colonial period are democracies today. Funny enough, that includes, for example, Cape Verde, a couple of the Portuguese colonies that have developed very, very neatly, despite the rather undemocratic way they were ruled in the colonial period. So this is the first indication that we have that there is persistence here over time in the choice of political institutions. The ones that were democratic, or at least reasonably democratic, in the late colonial period are the ones that are democratic today. On the other hand, just the raw data here do not seem to indicate that Acemoglu's idea about settlement patterns is correct. You can see here, no matter whether we focus on the red columns, were these countries democratic at independence? The orange column, whether the share of countries the last 25, the share of years the last 25 years that they have been coded as democratic, or the share of them that are democratic today. We actually see no significant differences between those that had few Europeans settled in the population in the early 1950s and those who had many. So this is bad news for the settler mortality or settler patterns hypothesis. Now, what we do here is that we then, of course, run proper regressions. These are cross-country regressions. We focus first on predicting whether or not they had colonial democracy. That is, whether they were democratic at independence, whether they had representative institutions 5 years prior to independence, and whether they had representative institutions at independence. And when I say representative institutions here, that both includes the full democracies and the multi-party systems where elections were managed no matter what. And if you look across this, you can actually see that there are very, very few stars. There are very few things that actually predict whether or not these countries were democratic at independence or close to independence. You can see that the countries that are democratic at independence are more likely to have higher institutions of higher education, and they're much more likely to be British. Essentially, the Brits introduced proper democracy prior to independence in a number of countries. On the other hand, the idea that, well, education is really important doesn't seem to matter for the other two indicators. The size of European population never ever matters. The log area, if it's larger countries or more populous countries, and the combination of those two is population density, never matters at all. So essentially, what we can do here is we can shoot down not only Acemoglu's settler pattern idea, but also a number of ideas from Lipset. The interesting thing, though, here, across these 65 countries where we have full data from the late colonial period, is that once we turn to try to predict modern democracy, things look rather different. So here you can see again, there are practically no stars here, and that is the same even if we try to clean up by adopting a general to specific approach. These variables do not become significant. But this is only the first half of the table. The bottom half is where we test for the effects of having had democratic political institutions before independence. And it's very easy here to see that having had democratic institutions in the late colonial period is by far the best predictor of whether a country is democratic today, and very, very clearly the best predictor of whether countries have been stably democratic for the last 25 years. Focusing just on the situation immediately before independence, it's only democracy that matters. If you go 5 years back, so the last two elections or two potential elections prior to independence, you can see a significant effect of just having had multi-party autocracy. So the managed elections that were typical in some French colonies. But the effect of having had fully democratic colonial institutions is much, much larger. So basically, our main message here is that you can consider all sorts of smart theories about why countries become democratic and why they are stably democratic. But looking across these 65 countries where we have full information from the late colonial period, the one main explanation for why countries are democratic is whether or not the colonial powers introduced or allowed democratic or representative institutions. Now, how can we understand these things? Well, sometimes you might have things built into the formal rules. And once they're built into formal rules, it's likely that they just continue that way. Many things that are built into countries' constitutions survive, even though you have coups and changes of government and so on. The constitution, once it's there, is fairly set in stone in most countries. So perhaps this is actually a matter of the constitutions that these countries either had from their colonial masters or that the countries wrote right at or right after independence. So what we did though was we coded up whether countries' first constitutions declared that the country was a democracy. We get most of that information from the Comparative Constitutions project. The ones that were not there, we have coded ourselves to the extent that it's actually possible, getting the country's very first constitutions and reading them. Now, what turns out is that 55% of the countries that did not declare themselves democratic at independence were actually democracies. 51% of the countries that declared themselves as democratic in the constitutions were not democratic at independence. Essentially, what we find is that your constitutional definition of what the political institutions look like is almost entirely irrelevant to the de facto situation then at independence, and irrelevant to the de facto situation now. So we can, in this way, to some extent, reject that this is something that's built into the de jure framework of the new country at independence. It has to be something else. And it might be political traditions. Once you have democracy, you don't want to go back. And it might be constitutional norms. That is, rules that are considered part of the constitution, even though they're not written in them. Now, finally, you might think that this is all just new stuff, because we all know that political institutions can vary a lot over time, and a number of these countries had coups. Bolivia, for example, which of course is a much older country, had 17 coup attempts in this period. A number of African countries had a fair number of coups. So that might have just changed things. However, if you look at this, what you can see is the red line is the share of countries in our sample that were not colonial democracies. And you can see from 1970 on that the share of those countries without a colonial democracy that are democratic at any given year. The blue one is the one that wants to start with colonial democracy. This is again just indicative, but the difference here between those two groups is just very, very stable. So it's not something that is specific to the last few years. It's not something that's specific to the last 25 years. This is a feature that we can find throughout the whole period in which these countries have been independent. Basically, what we find is that the colonial political institutions have been persistent and are very, very strong predictors of modern democracy, and conversely, they are strong predictors of modern autocracy. We also find that Acemoglu and Robinson's hypothesis about settlement patterns explains practically nothing. We can't say that these settlement patterns weren't important in Latin America or the Neo-Britons, of course. But in countries that become independent after 1950, we see absolutely no evidence that the share of Europeans or any of those kinds of patterns matter for the development of democracy. So essentially our paper ends with this William Faulkner quote, that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Your colonial history of democracy shapes whether or not your democracy today. And that's essentially what I wanted to show you. And I'm stop sharing my screen now and see what you say.
Okay, thanks, Christian. Folks, questions? Okay, I will start with a couple of questions and comments. Yeah. Tell us more about the data. What is, for instance, do you have a panel? What is the dimension of this data? And if you do have a panel, how are you actually estimating this? Because you mentioned, and you mentioned that in the paper as well, that you are estimating as a cross section.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that.
So we have a panel here. All 208 countries are observed every year since 1950. So it's a pretty large data set. Of course, not all of them have a colonial past, but they are all there. What we do is we estimate 2 cross sections for the simple reason that we only have, for example, the share of Europeans in the population in one observation. Unfortunately, the Statesman's Yearbook isn't consistent over time. So if you go back to the 1930s, it has different information. If you go further up in time, the information on the European population just disappears. So we can get that kind of information on educational institutions and the European population and so on from these years from 1950 to 1955, where they are there at all times. But it only gives us a cross-section with that information.
Okay, I see. There is a question here from Adrian. As a matter of interest, how do you characterize South Africa?
Adrian, that's a very good question.
It was coming.
Yeah. We have problems sometimes, and Yearbook and Vreeland had exactly the same problems. So the way we do it is we follow their coding scheme. If you have free and fair elections, that basically means international observers deem your elections free and fair, then you might be a democracy. But if you haven't had any changes in government within an institutional frame, you haven't proven that you are a democracy. And that's the case for South Africa. The ANC has won every single election with the present institutions. So we code South Africa as a civilian autocracy. But what we did was that, and that's one of the new things that wasn't in Yearbook and Vreeland, but we have in the new data set, is that we have an indicator whether elections are free and fair. So according to that indicator, South Africa is a democracy, but with the stronger, the more conservative coding rule, it isn't. And it's actually the same problem with Namibia. So Namibia starts as an independent country around 1990 with rigged elections. But at least from the 2004 elections, we have no information that there's any rigging or any funny things going on. So we code them as having free and fair elections from 2004 and until today. But we can't code Namibia as a full democracy because SWAPO has won every single election. It's a matter of how conservatively you code democracy. So Adrian, it's a great question. And that's how we do it.
Because I think there is also this debate. I remember looking at the Polity4 data for South Africa. And for instance, South Africa during apartheid was not coded as an autocracy. So it goes along. So there is another question here, Christian. To what extent do you think the impact of the Washington Consensus would have impacted and or maintained modern democracies in those countries, since most structural reforms, if not all, require democratic political systems to be implemented? So essentially the role of the Washington Consensus.
Yeah. It's a good question.
Does it belong in your paper? I think that's the broader question. Does it belong there or not at all?
Well, it's a very good question, really. And it's something that we think might be a good question for a separate paper, whether the colonial past actually affects how you reform and the degree to which you introduce reforms. Because a lot of countries did introduce reforms, some gave up halfway, and some didn't introduce reforms at all. It seems as if the countries that introduced these Washington Consensus reforms that included strengthening the judicial system are more likely to become stable democracies. because underlying democracy is a politically fairly independent judicial system and a fair degree of press freedom. But that means that you have to sort of implement the full package of the Washington Consensus. And as I see the evidence, it's only a few countries that introduced the full package, whereas a lot of countries introduced sort of halfway, introduced the deregulation, opened up their economies to trade, but really didn't do anything to their judiciaries.
I see. So let me, because when you were presenting, I was also thinking. So it appears that the take-home message is that what happened during the late colonial period is what really determines democracy. So, but then, do we actually know what happened in the early colonial period so that we could actually see some changes happening during the colonial period somehow?
Well, the big problem is that if you go to Achimoglu and Robinson's data for the early colonial period, you get a lot of information from Latin America, from the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. But a lot of the information from Africa is missing. And you get a lot of missing information from Asia too. So the countries that we are looking at that become independent after 1950 are typically not covered that well in data from the early colonial period. And it's very, very few of those countries that have actual political institutions in place in the early colonial period. It is essentially in our data, it's essentially only some of the Caribbean island states where you have political institutions of some kind back to the 18th century.
I see. So there is a question here, Christian, from Lumkili. Follow-up question on SA and Namibia coding. Is this not the future of Anglophone countries where dominant ethnic parties and or national liberation movements becoming dominant for a longer period?
Yeah, you could have that fear, and it's in some sense also what happened with Botswana, even though Botswana is a quite different story. But Ghana, for example, is different. Ghana has had a pretty vibrant democracy since the mid-1990s, where government changes hands and parties are not overly ethnically connected. You could see the same in North Africa in the Tunisian case, where the fear was after the Arab Spring that you would get a Muslim party and an old-fashioned party and so on. But the party system in Tunisia is quite in flux, and it seems right now to be approaching a normal Western party system with established ideology, established interest groups, and so on, instead of ethnic divisions. So I think you're right that in some cases, Namibia is a great case with SWAPO. You end up with having these dominant parties, but it's not the general picture.
I see, because sometimes they use this conversation, for instance, down here, that what happened, for instance, taking the Namibian and SA case, was essentially a sort of compromise right before independence between the British and the incoming liberation movement, essentially for commercial interests after independence. So.
I think that's part of the story in many French cases, actually, where you get this compromise between the French colonial powers and what becomes a dominant party about colonial interests and commercial interests with the old colonial power. But in those cases, the French colonial authorities simply rigged the elections to make sure that it ends up in the right way.
I see. So there is another question here, Christian, from Gabila. Do the proxies for democracy make provision for variations in the quality of democracies beyond electoral democracy? Do quality of institutions matter in the model?
It's a very, very good question. I think your question is directly related to the big discussion in democracy studies of how maximalist or minimalist a definition of democracy you want. So if you have a maximalist definition, it's not just whether you have democratic political institutions and government changes hands and so on, but it's also a number of other features that would be defining the quality of democracy. That means that those people who go for a maximalist definition also include the degree of press freedom. Sometimes they include the degree to which judicial institutions are effective. They might even, in some cases, include some kind of equality indicators and corruption indicators. That's what Freedom House does in their assessments. The big problem for us, and the reason why we went for a minimalist definition of democracy, is that if you have a maximalist definition of democracy in your data, there are a number of questions that you just can't ask. You can, with a maximalist measure of democracy, you can't ask whether democracy leads to better press freedom, because it's already included in your definition of democracy. So we prefer to use a minimalist definition of democracy, and a fairly conservative one of that, because it enables us and everyone who uses the data to ask those additional questions. And if you're interested in the other type of conceptualization, the Variety of Democracy database has a number of really, really nice indicators. The fun thing is, though, that they do not perfectly overlap with our data.
I got another question. Because there is, Christian, there is all this literature on the pre-colonial institutions, and in particular the role of the chiefs, and how the chiefs during colonialism in Africa, it's a typical African question, how the chiefs interacted with the Brits and with the French during the colonial period, and how that interaction could have an impact after independence. Is there any way that you can try to consider or interact that, or put in that in there somehow?
We would actually really have liked to be able to do that. It would require that we focused on Africa. We could do that, of course, but it also requires that we have relatively clear data on exactly how those chiefs interacted. We know that the chiefs interacted with the Brits in Bechuanaland, for example, and how that worked out. We also know that the French typically didn't interact with the chiefs in the same way. The French introduced parallel institutions because they wanted the French institutions to eventually supplant the indigenous institutions. The big problem there is access to relatively precise data, and Martin and I haven't found that kind of data. If any of you have an idea of how to get those data, I would love to hear from you. Just send me an email. So far, though, the best paper that we've seen on that is actually a British geographer called, I think it was called Whitley, who wrote a very nice paper in 1937 about that. But he's the one that comes closest to actually having fairly good information about that.
That would be very nice to have. That would be very, that would be groundbreaking, in fact. Folks, any other question or comment or suggestion to Christian? I don't see anyone raising their hands, Christian. Checking the chat. That's it. And Q&A, that's it. I think that's it. Would you like to add anything else?
Well, I just wanted to ask to thank you for the time and for your questions. I think they're very insightful, and just say that if any of you are interested in either the data or the paper or the, for that matter, the background data from the Statesman's yearbook, just send me an email. We'd be happy to share.
There is another question. Sorry about that. Sorry, Christian.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, good.
There is another question here. What is the rationale for the different approaches taken by the Brits versus the French?
Well, Whitley explains it with the fact that the French treated the colonies as part of France. So by 1946, when the Fourth Republic is introduced, they have to introduce elections in all of the colonies because the colonies elect members to the parliament in Paris. And that's because they treat every colony as part of France. The British treat every colony as unique and as part of the empire, but not a part of the United Kingdom. So they actually treat every colony in a different way than, for that matter, than its neighbor. And that also means that the Brits prefer to have a small bureaucracy and use the existing institutions as much as they can. The French, with their approach, prefers to set up French institutions run by French bureaucrats. And that's a big difference. And the Whitley paper is just a beautiful explanation of what's going on.
Thank you. Gabila, he said he's interested in the paper, interested in the data as well, especially data for Southern Africa. So Gabila, please get in touch with Christian. Folks, any other question or comment that I can pass to Christian? Okay, then that's it. Thank you all, and thank you, Christian, for taking part. And I think we had a very nice discussion. So I will stop recording this. Thank you.